All right. Well, welcome. Um, Thank you, everyone, for joining the GBSN for Energy Transitions virtual series, Powering the Energy Transition, A Tale of Two Hemispheres. We are thrilled for our fifth event in the series that is going to be focused on regulatory environments. As a few housekeeping reminders, this session will be recorded. Please keep your microphones muted, and we have reserved some time to address audience questions at the end of today's program. That being said, we encourage you to drop comments and questions in the chat at any time and to respond to others. Lastly, we invite you to use the chat right now to introduce yourself and where you're joining from. If you'd like to say words about the interests that brought you here, please feel free to add those as well. Now, I'd like to introduce Julianne Inarelli, Chief Impact Officer, for a few words.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's my pleasure to greet you and to thank you for joining us today. And I do want to encourage you, as Julie mentioned, to introduce yourself in that chat. We're a small community, a growing community, and this is a great opportunity to get to know who else is working in this space and towards these goals of a just energy transition. The Global Business School Network, as you may or may not know, is a not-for-profit bringing together business schools and other organizations focused on our mission of improving access to quality and locally relevant management education. And part of that local relevance is understanding how the issues change when we look at them through the lenses of different parts of the world. And we believe this relevance is essential in order for our communities globally to tackle the problems that we need to address for sustainable development. We do this at GBSN through impact communities. These communities focus on topics highly relevant to business and our broader world. And we're here today because of the energy transition impact community. And I just want to take a quick moment to introduce and thank the leaders of that group because it's their vision that has made this event series possible and their hard work that has brought us together now 5 times to talk about different aspects of a just energy transition. Those individuals are Sarah Craig and Yashar Jassi Farrakfal from the Rotterdam School of Management, Luazi Ngubavana and Maurice Radabe of Wits Business School, and Greg Bean of the University of Houston. And without any further ado, I'll pass the floor to Greg, who will be our moderator for today, and will kick us off. Greg?
Great. Thank you, Julianne, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to quickly introduce the energy transition impact community. This is a community that was formed, I guess about 18 months ago. And its goal is really to connect business schools that are involved in the energy transition to share ideas and allow and provide some joint activity to allow business schools to be relevant to the energy industry as we go through this transition. This is our 5th session, and our next session will be on financing the energy transition, and we will be publicizing the date for that shortly. So now I'd like to introduce today's topic, our session 5 topic, which is on the policy and regulatory environments of the energy transition. And our particular focus in this seminar series is on highlighting the differences and the similarities of situations in both the global north and the global south. So our webinar today will include a panel discussion from 4 panelists, and then we will follow that, time permitting, with questions for the panel from the audience via the chat. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. First, from the Global South, our academic practitioner is Dr. Nande Malumbazo. She's a senior lecturer at AELC in South Africa. And our second Global South practitioner, is a practitioner, is Notogozo Nkwabi, who is the Deputy Director General of the Energy Ministry in South Africa. From the Global North, our academic practitioner is Leonie Reens. She's Professor of Public Law and Sustainability at Erasmus School of Law in Holland. And Madeline Klein, who is our Global North practitioner, who is the Managing Director overseeing policy, market strategy, and government and regulatory affairs for ENGIE's distributed generation business here in North America. So thanks to all four of you for agreeing to participate. I'd like to give each panelist a couple of minutes to introduce themselves further, to talk maybe in a little more detail about their work in this policy and regulatory environment before we move to the general panel discussion. So Dr. Nandi, we'll start with you, please.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those that are in the Southern Hemisphere. My name is Dr. Nandi Malumbazo. I'm currently a senior lecturer at the School of Chemical and Metallurgical Engineering, as well as at the Africa Energy Leadership Center at Wits Business School. I'm actually lecturing energy policy and regulation. I also do research on just energy transition, as well as the use of coal beyond power generation, as well as carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as shale gas studies. So that's the work that I currently do, and that's my contribution towards both on science as well as on policy when it comes to energy transition. Thank you, Greg.
Great, thank you. Notogozo, please.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ntokozo Nkwabi. I am the Deputy Director General responsible for policy, global relations, and investment promotion in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. So I'm responsible for all the policies concerning the regulation in the energy space, from liquid fuels, electricity, nuclear, you name it, basically implementing all policies relating to energy, be it gas, anything energy, we do policies for. And it's quite exciting, to be part of this webinar this afternoon, because the very topic that we are discussing this afternoon talks to the work that we do, particularly in relation to just energy transition. I mean, we find ourselves at a time where South Africa is at a juncture where we need to balance eradicating energy poverty while pursuing the just energy transition path for the country. So I'm quite excited to be a part of this webinar and part of this community. Thank you, Greg.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then I'll shift to our two Global North representatives. First, Leonie.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Leonie Reins, and I am actually, as Greg mentioned, a lawyer. So I work for the law school. And what I do is I look at the role of law in the climate and energy transition. And I see it mainly that law has three functions. It can be a brake, it can function as an accelerator, and it can function as a steering wheel towards the energy transition. And besides those three functions, there's also a lot expected from the law. It needs to foster technological innovation, protect consumers, support businesses, and of course also address potential unintended consequences. And so that is what my research is largely about. And I do, on the one hand, look at specific technologies, such as actually shale gas as well, and hydrogen. but also the more underlying theoretical considerations. What does that mean for energy democracy and energy justice? I look mostly at EU law, but because the topic is international in its nature, and only international or broader solutions can actually get us to what we want, I also venture into international law.
Great, thank you. And our second Global North panelist, Madeline, please.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Madeline Klein. I'm Managing Director of Policy and Market Strategy for the Distributed Solar and Storage Group at ENGIE in North America. Just a quick introduction of ENGIE for those of you who are not familiar. ENGIE is a very big company. Our headquarters is in Paris. We have almost 100,000 employees in 31 different countries all over the world. ENGIE's made accelerating the energy transition really central to its mission statement. We have a global goal of getting to net zero by 2045. And we know that in order to do this, the business has to succeed by doing things that have a positive impact on people and the planet. And that means making the clean energy transition affordable, reliable, and just. We're working very hard. We're making a ton of investments in renewable energy, flexible energy, security of supply, green hydrogen, to really support the energy future that has lower carbon. Distributed solar and storage, as I mentioned, is my forte here at ENGIE. I work in Chicago. Came to ENGIE through an acquisition of SoCore Energy about 10 years ago. And, you know, frankly, the transition of the distributed solar and storage industry in the last 10 years, over those 10 years, has been a bumpy ride. We call it, those of us in the industry call it the solar coaster, for good reason. But we are very, very optimistic about the future of distributed energy and see it as a key element to make clean energy happen worldwide. My job is to help translate the policies and the regulatory environment, both internally to our business teams, and then also advocate for the policies and regulations that will help accelerate clean energy in each one of the 50 states. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. Okay, so hopefully those introductions help our audience have some background and some perspective on the different panelists, where they're coming from, where their current work is. So we'll start the panel discussion with one of the most important and I think most interesting areas with respect to policy and regulatory environments, and that is around the concept of a just energy transition. Several of our panelists mentioned this in their opening remarks. The priorities and perceptions of what constitutes a just energy transition differ widely in different regions. And so our first question to our panelists is what are the elements of a just energy transition that are most emphasized in the policy and regulatory trends in your environment? And what does that suggest about national or regional priorities? And maybe we'll start this question with Ntokozo.
Thank you, Greg. So when we talk just energy transition, I think it's important, particularly on platforms such as these, to talk about how we define just energy transition in the global north, what it means for the global north versus what it means for the global south, because the struggles are different. We are at different levels of development. We are at different levels of energy access. We are at different levels in terms of meeting SDG 7. And now talking about just energy transition and ESG, we are finding more and more that the E and the G are loud, but the S not so loud. So I think we are at a point where we need to amplify the S, the social aspect that gets left behind, people that get affected, broader social impacts are not so much spoken about. We look more on the economic side or the economic aspect as well as governance, but very little is done on the social part. And the net effect of that is, I did quite a bit of reading sometime last year about where the whole just transition concept comes from, and looking into the history of it and the fact that it came as a result of unions fighting to say, as there is more and more push towards environmentally friendly production and means of working or means of doing business, more and more people are losing jobs. And this is what we're seeing already, we're starting to see already in South Africa, case in point being the example of Komati Power Station, which is the first power station that has been repurposed, where people are left behind. The S is not so amplified. I know that there's some work being done to train and reskill the people who used to work at that power station. But nobody is saying, we're not saying much about the people who worked at the feeder mine that were mining coal, supplying that particular power station. So it's job losses at the power station as well as job losses at the mine itself that was feeding that power station. So I think that there still is a gap, particularly in that area in South Africa, that we all need to focus on and amplify and actively do something about it. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Nandi, your thoughts on this topic?
Thank you, Greg. From my side, theoretically, just energy transition of a country should have an ability to actually simultaneously deliver the three priorities or elements. And those are the ability to actually support economic development and growth of a country. Secondly, it's the universal access to secure and reliable energy supply. And thirdly, environmental sustainability across the energy value chain. So those are the three pillars that we should consider for just energy transition. So this will then thereby will maintain a balanced energy triangle at the end of the day. And let's say a country will need to have a long-term goals for this balanced energy transition so that it can actually support the choice of appropriate policies, which is the policies that will then support the just energy transition, as well as the instruments that should actually synchronize the efforts for a particular country. So the energy transition for South Africa towards decarbonization. In South Africa, we actually have, I think, almost 77% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from the energy sector, whether it's electricity or the transport sector or the industry, the petrochemical industry. But then, in essence, 77% of such is coming from the energy sector. So in order for the country to enable the energy transition, we actually need electricity planning. And we do have such through a document that is called an Integrated Resource Plan, which was promulgated in 2019. But currently that particular document is also under review, as well as the governance, which needs to be brought in line with the rapidly changing technology options that we have, and so that we can actually have an economically feasible emission trajectory. So the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, which is DMRE, where my colleague Ntokozo is currently working at, has embarked actually on that process to actually review the IRP, which is the Integrated Resource Plan for Electricity. And in parallel with this process, we have a committee that is called the Presidential Climate Change Commission Committee, which convenes a series of public debates as well as events across the country, so that we can actually look at the energy mix that we have and also the energy mix of the future. We have seen also an increased usage when it comes to renewable energy and reduced usage of fossil fuel in South Africa. The reduced usage of fossil fuel is coming from decommissioning of some of the coal-fired power plants. And also these plans are actually embedded on the IRP itself. So as my colleague has said, in South Africa, we have a different context when it comes to just energy transition. When it comes to also the social component of the energy transition, which is becoming a challenge for the country. We are well aware that as we are going towards the just energy transition, there is a social component which we also need to achieve. As much as we are actually achieving an energy transition, we should not forget that the main mandate of the country, or of the policies that we have of the country, which is the National Development Plan, is on poverty alleviation and reducing the high employment rate that we have in the country. So our just energy transition also needs to balance that social component. I think that's it from my side, Greg. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll shift now to the perspectives from the global north. What are the elements of a just transition that are most emphasized with respect to the policy and regulatory trends in your environment? And we've got representatives of both North America and Europe. Maybe we'll start with Europe first. Leonie, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Greg. So traditionally in the EU, energy justice or just transition was about energy security, affordability, and sustainability. And after the Second World War, the focus was really on energy security. And in the recent years and the last decade, you could clearly see that the shift was more towards the sustainability aspect, in the sense of the environmental part of sustainability. I agree with the previous speakers, even though the definitions are very different. Also, the social part is here an issue. And there was a lot of legislation on renewable energy in the last decades. That was actually until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which led to a very big energy supply problem in the European Union, because the EU was very much dependent on natural gas from Russia. And there was in the increasing discussion where we had enough gas to get through the winter, and the gas became very expensive, and electricity also very expensive. So the focus from renewable shifted again just last year back to energy supply security, but then also for the first time really explicit with this social element that in the European Union there were lots of vulnerable consumers who cannot pay their electricity bills anymore. And then obviously we also have this more let's say definition of energy justice and transition based in justice theory. And there, I guess the problem who receives what. So distributive justice is one of the key problems also in the union, but then at a different level. So the problems that we here have is that if you, for example, look at who owns electric cars, this is also only a certain income level who can afford it, and then indirectly benefit from expensive petrol, which they now can replace by electricity. So this is one of the problem. And then also, if you think about recognition justice, so who is misrepresented, digitalization is one of the key focuses when we also talk about just transition. And there we have, again, the social aspect, the vulnerable people, the elderly who don't have iPhones and are not technical adverse. They are risking to be excluded. And then also the last part, if you talk about procedural justice, so who decides? That is a critical element also. And where do you, for example, draw the lines? If you think about building offshore wind parks, onshore wind parks, who is included? Where do you draw the lines? Is it the people within 5 kilometers, within 500 meters? So, and how the decisions are actually being made. And this is something that we can see in the European Union, that there is increasing opposition to measures actually implementing the energy transition, because people do not feel represented. So different context, but still I would agree with my previous speakers that the social dimension is also one of the biggest challenges that we face in the European Union.
Okay, thank you. And Madeline, in North America, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I'll just say that the three-part paradigm that Nandi laid out, having the energy transition really be about equity of access to energy, reliable, safe, and affordable energy, economic development, jobs, et cetera, and then environmental protection and sustainability, creating healthy communities. I think that those are I think, worldwide principles that we all agree on, and those certainly are the ones that are driving the discussion around justice and the energy transition in the United States as well. There has been a very explicit inclusion of justice in regulation, legislation recently. The Biden administration in 2021 announced what they call their Justice 40 initiative. And their goal is to have 40% of the benefits of the energy transition flow to historically disadvantaged communities. So those are communities of low-income people, communities that have been left behind in sort of American job growth and success historically. They've historically suffered prejudice. They've historically suffered the disadvantages of having the fossil fuel industry focused in that community, environmental pollution, et cetera. They've lost jobs due to those transitions from the fossil economy to the clean energy economy. And so the Biden administration said, those communities are going to be a focus of policy for that administration. And you see that in the text of the Inflation Reduction Act. There are additional advantages to cite clean energy projects in communities that have had fossil fuel plants shut down, that have had fossil mines, coal mines in particular, shut down, that do suffer from pollution, brownfield land that has been corrupted in the past by different industries. You also have advantages for citing projects in low-income communities where the poverty, where many folks are living below the poverty line. And then, job creation is another very explicit goal of the Inflation Reduction Act. I would say that is probably, second to hitting the carbon emission reductions that the legislation intends for us to hit. I think job creation is certainly the other primary goal. So there are, again, incentives for locating manufacturing of clean energy technologies, of the clean energy supply chain in communities that have been historically hit by factories closing and the end of well-paying jobs and stable jobs that those communities had for so much of the 20th century. And so that is a very, very explicit part of the US policy right now. It also heavily plays into the politics of the energy transition in the US. And I think probably that may be where Greg may want to take us next. So I'll leave that on a quick cliffhanger note, and we can get to the next question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Madeline. So, we've heard about, the different perspectives on what is a just transition and what is going on within the individual regions with respect to trying to accelerate that. But one of the big challenges that we are collectively facing is that actions, movements towards a low carbon energy world, actions that are taken in one region could potentially have unintended consequences in another region. This has become a central focus, or one of the central focuses of discussion, and particularly between the policymakers and industry practitioners in the global South versus the global North. So I'd like to explore that a little bit. What are the potential unintended consequences of actions to reduce carbon in one region that could have unintended consequences in another? What are the risks of that happening, and what can be done to mitigate that? And again, I think we'll start with the global South. Maybe Dr. Nandi, you could start, please.
Thank you, Greg, for that question as well. I think previously on the previous question that you have asked, we've highlighted the one challenge or one risk, which is the job losses. So as we all know that currently in the country, in South Africa, the fossil fuel sector employs almost 120,000 people across the whole across the whole value chain. And it is well actually understood that some of these job losses will not be replaced on a one-to-one ratio when it comes to then the just energy transition or decarbonization. But as much as that is understood, there should be also other ways for industrialization in the country to make sure that the job opportunities are created not only in the energy sector, but in other sectors as well. That's one challenge. And secondly, we actually know that South Africa has is a high carbon intensive industry, which accounts more than the domestic users when it comes to then the energy usage. So decarbonization might pose a risk on reducing investment on industrialization, which might then also lead to reduced economic development during the transition period, more especially when it comes to small businesses whom were actually highly dependent on the fossil fuel industry for economic development. So these can actually be mitigated by developing a circular economy industry, as well as through the identification and definition of critical minerals, which are then going to be needed for decarbonization. And I think these should be among the mitigation measures that should be considered for future. And I think this will in return promote economic diversification into the industrial sector. Thirdly, or lastly from my side, when it comes to, we know that just energy transition, it's more about the power market reform. So in such an instant, there will also be an increased demand side participation and significant changes to actually how the grid network operates, which also we have to consider the fact that we need to also transform the grid as much as we are trying to open up the market when it comes to power generation. But also we need to look at what effective ways that can actually be utilized, or that can actually be looked at for grid expansion, because if we don't do such, and we also need to consider that now that we are trying to transition from a high carbon intensive economy to a low carbon intensive economy, we'll actually be using variable primary energy sources for power generation. And this might have a risk when it comes to collapsing the grid. And I think that's it from my side. Thank you, Greg.
Okay, thank you. And Ntokozo, from your perspective, your thoughts, and in particular, in the ministry, there must be discussions with respect to actions that are being taken in other places, particularly in the global north, which are potentially causing some concern towards the goal of a just transition, energy transition in South Africa. So could you give us your views on that?
So thanks, Greg. I'll just talk about, by way of example, the cross-border adjustment mechanism, and talk about the taxes. We've looked into detail at what the impact of such a policy decision would have on the global south and South Africa in particular. And the first thing that we see is broadly the economic impact. The way these cross-border taxes are structured, firstly, it was a unilaterally done policy decision by the EU, which we found not to be in the spirit of the climate negotiations and the support mechanisms that are pledged within the Paris Agreement negotiations. Now, the economic impact that these taxes would have on the global south is due to the fact that, firstly, it would affect the competitiveness of our exports and therefore potentially reduce our foreign exchange earnings. In South Africa, for example, we get a lot of forex earnings from exporting coal, for example. And the imposition of cross-border taxes on that commodity would place South Africa at a disadvantage in terms of our foreign earnings. And linked to that, these taxes may lead to the carbon leakage, where the emissions-intensive industries, which most countries in the global south depend on, would relocate from countries where the unemployment rate is dire, and therefore perpetuates, the economic challenges that the global south face. But also developmental challenges. The global south relies mostly on industries that are of high carbon emissions intensity in nature, such as manufacturing, and taxes in this regard would place an additional burden on such commodities. I mean, I've made an example with the export of coal. I'm just making an example with coal alone. There's quite a range that we are exporting in South Africa, but also goods that are manufactured from power generated from coal would be subjected to those carbon taxes, and that would really affect the developmental challenges of the global south. But we've also looked at issues around inequality. It is a fact, it is a known fact that both the global south and the global north are at different levels of development. The global north is at an advanced stage insofar as technologies and resources to adapt and offset the carbon tax burden. So the global south is at a disadvantage because we are not at the same level of development in terms of technologies and abilities to make it easier and cheaper for the global south to mitigate and offset these carbon taxes. We also looked at adaptation versus mitigation. There was a mini study, just informal study, that we did with the Department of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry. And out of that study, we could see that it would be quite costly. And South Africa, given the state of, firstly, state of the fiscus, but also the state of the rate of unemployment and the level of dependency, with a large population on social security, for example. If we are to implement our adaptation plans and mitigation plans, they are quite costly, and we would have to divert funds from the fiscus away from basic needs, such as healthcare and social welfare, to adaptation and mitigation. So a paced transition and a paced, not blanket approach policy decision would work better for the global south, because then it would be at a scale and pace that a country can afford at a given point in time. And lastly, I just want to make this comment. I think there is a need for coherence in the carbon border adjustment mechanism policies and global development goals. Because if we don't find that coherence and alignment and find a balance, then we will tamper with the very economic fiber of countries in the global south, and therefore perpetuating poverty in the global south and placing countries in the global south at a disadvantage for a long time to come. I'll pause there for now. Thanks, Greg.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then shift on this topic, unintended consequences. We'll move to Global North. Leonie, I know that this is a big topic of discussion in Europe and in the EU, both thinking about policies and their impacts within the EU, as well as obviously in the international trade that the EU has with the rest of the world, particularly the developing countries in the global south. So interested in your perspectives around that, the risks of unintended consequences, and what some of the thinking is in the EU about how to avoid that.
Thank you very much. And actually, I'm very happy that I'm not a representative from the European Commission, but an academic, so I can say whatever.
You can speak. You can speak
exactly.
freely.
I can speak freely, and I really appreciate how you formulated the question, Greg, stressing the unintended negative consequences. But let's look at the elephant in the room. I think a lot of the consequences might not be so unintended. I mean, there are smart people working in the European Commission, so they should know about the problems that the previous speakers actually raised. So I'll come back to that in a bit. There are certainly also unintended consequences, but I think the overall idea of what we call extraterritorial effects in law, so that's the I guess legal term for that, unilateralism or extraterritorial effect, is a new way that the European Union, the European Commission came up with to govern the energy transition or address climate change at large. And the previous speakers mentioned the CBAM, but this is certainly not the only example. We have the batteries regulation, we have the corporate sustainable due diligence directive, and the deforestation regulation. So I think we all can agree in principle that they fulfill a laudable objective, namely in terms of the deforestation regulation to stop deforestation. But what it boils down to is it prohibits third countries from making policy choices. And if we take the example of the deforestation legislation, to choose in which manner they want to operate their land and their soil. And then we have these mechanisms called coordination and technical assistance mechanisms, which are in that directive included in Article 15 and 30, being the real lawyer here. And they seek to mitigate negative impacts. But if we look at the reality, and my previous two speakers of the Global South have made this clear, in the end, it's the EU telling third countries, you do as we require, otherwise you will not be able to put our products in the market. And I don't need to repeat the consequences, as awful as they are. I think what is also one consequences is, and that might be actually an unintended one, is that this also leads to a consolidation of the market power, meaning that large companies have the capacity and the manpower to even understand these kind of legislation and requirements. I have to say, I try to look at the details. They're not even understandable for me. And I know that also there are people in the European Union working in law firms having to implement this. They have also very difficulties in understanding it, but it will also include, and this enforces the imbalances and the effects on the third country, forces small and medium-sized and companies out of the market. And actually, one last remark that I wanted to make, which I thought was very interesting, that Nkoto referred to the CBAM as a tax. And I think this is a very important and interesting angle, because the European Commission tries to stress in all their communication that this is everything but a tax. Because indeed, if it would classify as a tax, there would be issues in terms of world trade, within the World Trade Organization. So I think it's just a matter of time. I have to admit, I haven't checked it, whether countries actually go to the World Trade Organization in this context. So that is my input here. Yeah.
Great. No, thank you. I appreciate that. And also the mention of some of the other extraterritorial plans and legislations beyond the border adjustment, including deforestation and things like that. I think that's quite interesting. Madeline, from a US or North American perspective, I'm wondering about the thoughts about this, and it could be in the North American case, both unintended consequences of US legislation, and I'm thinking specifically about things like domestic content and subsidies and things like that, and also being potentially a victim of some unintended consequences of regulations in other areas. Interested in your thoughts. This is, I think, less of a topic, at least currently, in North America, but I think one that's going to pretty rapidly grow in importance. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think to take a little bit of a historical view on this one, climate change is the ultimate injustice, right? Now we're having to deal with the repercussions of trying to address climate change. But let's go back to climate change being the ultimate injustice, where the global north, particularly the United States, is responsible for the bulk of the emissions. And now the global south is going to have to bear the brunt of the worst effects of climate change. And for too long, as we know, the United States government wanted to pretend that climate change wasn't happening, or maybe it was happening, but it wasn't our fault, or maybe it was happening, but there's nothing we could do about it anyway, or, so we spent far too long in that mode. And now finally, in the last few years, and I should say that the states, many of the states have had taken action on climate change prior to this, but the federal government has really only been able to get serious about this in the last few years. And the Inflation Reduction Act was really the first major piece of federal legislation that takes climate change seriously. But the politics of the Inflation Reduction Act and the politics of the United States taking climate change seriously and acting on the global stage are very, very fragile in the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act was a party line vote. 0 Republicans voted in support of the Inflation Reduction Act. It passed because the Democrats had majority in the House and the Senate, and of course the Biden administration was a big champion. The House, now that it has flipped and is now in control of the Republicans, has now voted to repeal the clean energy provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act twice. That repeal hasn't gone anywhere because there's been a barrier in the Senate. Of course, the Biden administration has veto power. But this is a very lopsided, the politics of this are still very, very lopsided in the United States. And, what that means is that over time, this domestic industrial policy, where we are building out the manufacturing base for the clean energy economy in the United States, in the red states, is extremely important to constituency building for having a sustainable future for our climate change action here in the United States. If the heartland, the Midwest, the South, the swing states do not feel that climate action is supportive of their own interests, if they do not see the real tangible benefits, because there's a factory that opened that's producing electric vehicles down the road, or another factory up the road that's producing batteries or solar panels, they're not going to support this over the long term. And so that's why the Inflation Reduction Act, in my mind, was crafted in such an intelligent way, because it is creating the constituencies that it needs to be self-sustaining over the longer term. And to me, that's fundamental. Without the United States being in on this battle, the world is going to have a really hard time meeting emission reductions, and folks all over the world, including and especially in the global South, will have to, bear the worst effects of climate change. So, there's that. I think that a couple other places where we do have unintended consequences of growing out the energy transition at a pace that is really necessary to deal with climate change is in transmission. We don't have the transmission infrastructure to add clean energy to the grid as quickly as we need to. We need to increase our transmission infrastructure many fold, so that wind and solar and energy storage can do the job that that we all hope that they will do in the U.S. electricity grid. We've got to figure out places to put those transmission lines. And there's a lot of land in the US, but there's not a lot of unloved land. And there are constituencies and local communities everywhere that don't want large transmission lines running through their homes, their homeland. And we have to balance that. It's essential that we're not sacrificing the autonomy of local communities. We're not sacrificing the environment in order to pull clean energy onto the grid. Finally, I just want to mention critical minerals is going to be, it's already a big topic. It's going to be a big topic. There are about 50 critical minerals that the world is going to need much more of in order to have a successful energy transition. Lithium, nickel, copper are the big three, but there's many others. We as a globe, we as the global North have to figure out the right way to dramatically increase sourcing of these critical minerals without sacrificing environmental protection, while protecting workers' rights, while respecting indigenous communities. We've got to figure this out and get it right so that we can increase security for all.
Great, thank you. I think it's very helpful, and I think for our audience members who are not in the U.S. or North America, it's hopefully interesting for them to note that a lot of our challenges with respect to unintended consequences are within the United States, within certain areas of the United States, probably more so than with respect to what's going on outside the U.S. But that's becoming very increasingly important and subject to change, as Madeline mentioned. Okay, so I'd like to shift now. We were talking about definitions of a just transition and some of the challenges around unintended consequences, and a lot of those are cross-border, so to speak. I'd like to have the panelists now focused on their specific region, okay? And take a step back. And when we're talking about, policy and regulatory environments, when you take a look at the policy actions that are in place or have happened so far in your region, how would you rate the progress with respect to getting to, a low carbon or net zero world, according to the Paris Accord? So I'd like you to rate your region's policy effectiveness with a 10, meaning that all the necessary policies and regulations are in place, and a 1, meaning nothing is really in place. And you can define the region that you want to speak about. Maybe start with Leonie, if you want to maybe talk about the EU, and you can kind of maybe clarify what region you want to talk about, and then give us your rating and talk a little bit about why you rate that.
So I think I need to make a distinction here of what we have on paper and what we have in practice, what we can actually observe. So if we look at what we have on paper, we have quite a lot. I would end up as a high number. We have the climate law with a complete binding objective to 2050 net zero. We have interim targets. We have a lot on paper. We have the European Green Deal, which requires that every law and policy making, also in areas that are not typically linked to climate and energy, could be, I don't know, education, could be pension, could be family, whatever you can think about, needs to be scrutinized under the umbrella of sustainability, if you want to put it broadly. So on paper, we have a lot, but you asked me to give a, a scale, and you stressed the effectiveness. So I think combining the two, I would not give more than a 5, because I think the issue that we have in the European Union is public acceptance of these policies, and also implementing and enforcing them in practice, and that's to do without leaving anyone really behind, as is literally one of the I don't know whether I should call it a slogan or a legal requirement that the Commission has. So to have a just transition without leaving anyone behind. That is not easy. Also seeing that we have a lot of climate litigation, which tells the individual member states, but also the European Union as such, okay, you have your targets, but you're not, or the governments, but also private companies such as the Uganda judgment will say, you're not doing enough. Now, I also want to give a positive example for a change. So in Germany, there is in the traditional, also vulnerable region state with low income, lots of wind, but not a lot of industry. The policy is called Citizen and Municipal Participation Act, and they now require wind farm project companies to let municipalities and also private person participate 20% of the project companies' shares. So there in that region, it has been clear that the people also don't have the financial power to invest in wind farms. So there has been a law which forces the operators and the project companies to give them earnings in that wind farm. It has of course been before court, and the company argued that this would be partly expropriation, but the court actually did not agree with that. They said that this was actually project was a pilot project, a pilot law, which was really tried to address public participation. So this is maybe a way forward to also increase public acceptance and to make those laws to be implemented. But I see this as the challenge rather than having the necessary legislation in place on a more let's say global or European policy level.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Notakozo, please, you want to provide your perspective on this? And again, this is within your region, however you define the region, if it's just South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa or even Africa overall, how would you rate the progress in terms of policy and regulation that's required to meet the Paris goals, and why?
Thanks, Greg. Well, I know that at the level of AU, there are studies to look at SADC, Africa as a whole, and what just energy transition must look like on the continent. But I just want to comment quickly about South Africa. And I will align myself with Leonie on this. There's quite a lot on paper, but not so much in action. I don't even know what number to attach to this in terms of a rating. For example, in South Africa, we've got, we're very quick to develop the nationally determined contributions, sectoral emission targets, the Just Energy Transition Plan, famously known as the JETP. And there's quite a lot of noise from different quarters about the JETP, but not so much on its implementation, is clear. We also have the National Energy Efficiency Strategy developed by the department and the Integrated Resource Plan. And of all of these, in the main, really, we're seeing quite a bit of movement and traction on the implementation of the Integrated Resource Plan and the National Energy Efficiency Strategy. But on the others, not so much. But I also want to say that much as the NDCs and the SET talk across different sectors of the economy, there's quite a bit of silence in other sectors and more focus on the energy sector in South Africa. I mean, the construction sector, you don't hear much being said about them meeting their targets, the mining sector, the mobility sector, which is another big contributor. Not much is being said. There is just this big focus on the energy sector against what is there in writing. So I would also say that I think in South Africa, we still have quite a bit to do in terms of the implementation. But from a policy development side, I would say in that perspective, there's quite a lot of movement, there's quite a lot of traction coming on stream, but we just need to be firm in the implementation and the execution of those commitments. Thanks, Greg. And I'm sorry, Greg, I will have to exit at this point. Thanks.
And thank you very much. We really appreciate your contributions as a panelist. Thank you very much. And I think it's particularly interesting that there's the similarities of a lot on paper and not much on practice. But I think Notakozo also points out that at least in South Africa, most of the focus has actually been on the energy producing sector, with less around on the consumption sector, the different transport, industrial consumption sectors. And that may be an area that would rate lower in terms of what policies and regulations are actually needed. Maybe jump over to Madeline. From a US perspective, how would you rate what we have in place from a policy and regulatory perspective to what's needed, and what's behind some of your thinking on the rating?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I also am I'm struggling to sort of land on the right number. So, I'm going to give the U.S. Sort of a hopeful 5 at this point. I think we also have a paper versus progress question mark right now, as as in other parts of the world as well. I think the positive things, the things that we have going for us, and this is not just a U.S. Positive, this is a global positive, but the economics of clean energy technology, solar, storage, wind, have dropped dramatically over the last 10 years, 90% cost reductions. And that has enabled a tremendous upward trend in the build out of those technologies. And that hasn't happened, you know, by accident. It's happened because of a variety of policies, you know, that we could spend a whole session debating across the globe. But it has set the stage for, you know, the possibility of dramatic reductions in the electric sector in the U.S. And of course, the electric sector has historically been one of the largest emitters. We're also growing electric vehicles and charging infrastructure very dramatically as well. 20 million electric vehicles on the road. We're expecting another 35% growth in the next year or so. So that's very significant as well. Heavy industry is a challenging sector to decarbonize, but there has been some progress there. All of these elements have made it possible, I think, that the U.S. could potentially meet the goals under Paris and that were codified in the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, the modeling shows that with the IRA incentives and policy structures, we could reduce emissions 40% below 2005 by 2030. We could hit net zero by 2050. That could happen. That has to be supplemented by real tangible policy at the state level and at the regional level. Regional and state policy is what controls the mechanics of our electrical system. Federal government really doesn't regulate the electric system in the United States. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission certainly has a lot to say about it, but it's state public utility commissions and the regional transmission system operators that have the bulk of the say about our electric system. So we need to do collectively, industry, NGOs, government officials, these network and transmission operators, we collectively need to do an awful lot of work to figure out how to, what policies, what regulations, what market structures are really necessary in order to fully decarbonize electricity while maintaining safety and reliability and affordability of the electric grid. That's a tremendous challenge. And I don't think any practitioner in the US right now, regardless of what side of the table they sit on, would tell you that we're doing well on that account. We're not doing well. We're at the very beginning, and it's an enormous challenge.
Great.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Dr. Nandi, your reflections on where your region is, either South Africa specifically or Southern Africa, in terms of what's required from a policy or regulatory perspective to meet the Paris Accords, and what is behind your thinking about where you are?
Thank you, Greg. From my side, I think I really do agree or concur with what Ntokozo was actually saying, to say the most focus in South Africa has been on electricity generation when it comes to just energy transition, and not more on the petroleum, on the production of your petroleum products, the usage of or introduction of EVs vehicles in the country. So on a scale of 1 to 9, I would actually be fair enough to give South Africa a 5, because I believe that we are in between. We do have policies that are there. And we have seen that there has been a carbon tax was actually introduced in the country in 2019. The energy diversification of energy mix. Also, it's something that the country has actually committed itself to, which is the increased usage of your renewable energy. Recently, the unbundling of Eskom, yes, there are plans that are there, even though you'd find that there are some unions that are actually saying those plans are too vague. So you'd find that there are actually challenges on that aspect, but also the commitment from the government side, there was a regulation, or there was an introduction of a national transmission system operator, which is, I think it's a huge success for the country, because the country is currently not for unbundling of Eskom, which is the power utility that it has. So the energy regulator actually did, there was a license that was for the introduction of the transmission system operator, which was, I think, introduced, 3 months back in around June this year. And also we've seen a rise on investment, more especially from the industry, when it comes to renewable energy, installation of the solar. They are actually, more especially the mining companies, they are actually now generating their own electricity. And some of them are actually saying if they generate in excess, then they will have to sell such back to the power utility, which is then Eskom. So also, if I can just touch based on the just energy transition in the index stats. In 2021, South Africa was actually ranked 110. But for the 2023 stats, South Africa is actually sitting at 82, meaning that there are improvements when it comes to the regulatory framework that is in place, and as well as the incorporation and use of clean energy into the energy system, your carbon price scheme, which is through the introduction of the carbon tax itself. So I think with such, this is actually encouraging. It's an encouraging process, such that it will also at the same time lead to an increased investment as well as political commitment towards just energy transition or decarbonization. So I think I believe South Africa, when it comes to then the regulatory framework, we are doing better, but then also the implementation and execution of such, which needs both the government and the industry and the people of South Africa. Thank you, Greg.
Great, thank you. I'd like to explore one last point of distinction between the regions and that we've been speaking about, and that is when we think about what has been some of the primary government interventions, and we talk about policy, but what are some of the interventions that the different government entities have relied on more than others? So for an example, in the US, we have, at least at the federal level, tended to rely on subsidies in the form of tax credits to incentivize progress towards the low carbon goals. But there's quite a bit of difference in the intervention and the nature of the interventions. And I'd be interested in hearing the perspectives from each one in terms of which of those have been most numerous, and or maybe which have been the most effective so far. And Leonie, we start with you, please.
Yes. So I think I can tell you more what doesn't really work and hasn't been used so much.
That's fine.
And what works and has been used so much. So taxation, for example, is increasingly difficult in the European Union because actually of how the competence between the member states and the union is set up. So in practice, it would require unanimity, but so in theory, it would require a unanimity, but in practice, there's always at least one member state who vetoes. So that also means that the Energy Taxation Directive hasn't been reviewed in a long time. I think in a decade or so, and essentially, it's impossible to update it and negotiate it, and as a consequence for that, with energy transition, excitation, at least on the European Union level, on the member states level, that's again different. It's not useful at all because the current regime is actually subsidizing fossil fuels practices in there. What the European Union has relied upon a lot is, I guess, monitoring and reporting obligations, which then in the end results into naming and shaming of the member states. So that is, I guess, one of the issues, one of the things that the European Union uses a lot. Subsidies are also more used on the member state level, but also now for hydrogen. So I think there's actually a policy mix that the union employs. I'll leave it at that because I think otherwise there's not enough time for the others to answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. I realize that in some environments, particularly like in the EU, there have been most of the potential interventions have been at least tried in some way, shape, or form. So, Madeline, in the US, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more. As you mentioned, there's been quite a big change recently, and what seems to be the government seems to be using, and if we have any data yet on what seems to be working.
Yeah, well, like Leonie said, there are things that we know don't work in the U.S. There's a very specific, graveyard sitting somewhere next to Washington, D.C. of all the climate policies that we've tried and failed to implement over the years. Tried cap and trade regime that failed. Tried carbon tax, that failed. Tried regulation. The Supreme Court just ruled last year that the Environmental Protection Agency does not have the power to regulate climate change emissions. So we can call that a failure now too. What has worked, and this is really the only thing that's worked, is subsidies, as Greg said. The main federal subsidy that has been very successful over the years is the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. Those are used for wind and solar deployment, and now the investment tax credit can be used for energy storage deployment as well. So these policies have served as sort of the foundation of the country's effort to really change the market and allow clean energy technologies to compete with fossil fuel technologies that have been subsidized for a century or more at this point. And so the investment tax credit, the production tax credit has allowed clean energy to kind of get a foot in the door. There's been a variety of really innovative and interesting programs that the states have pioneered to help level the playing field and catalyze the clean energy industry within a state. And those have been very, very valuable programs as well that has allowed our industries really to take hold. And then finally, I do want to mention the voluntary market. I want to give a shout out to corporations, both American corporations and then foreign corporations that are doing business in the U.S. The corporate sector has some clean energy goals, sustainability goals, emissions reduction goals that they take very seriously, and that's evolved over time. It didn't start that way, but we now are seeing that as 2025 is approaching, some of these corporations are really hustling to meet their clean energy goals, and that does mean signing long-term power purchase agreements for for wind and solar. It means taking very seriously their objectives of getting more clean energy into their mix. And so that is another, I think, significant component of the transition that's happening here in the U.S.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. And I think it's interesting to note at least some of the parallels between the EU and federal US in terms of things that have been tried and failed. But not only that, but also the member states in the EU and the individual states in the US, in some cases, have been able to implement different types of initiatives that have not been able to be implemented in at the federal level. And of course, that includes in the US, mainly California and a few states in the Northeast that have been able to advance significant policy initiatives that have not been able to work at the federal level. Lastly, I'd like to go to Dr. Nandi. Maybe you could talk a little bit about you've touched on some of the interventions that have been made from a policy perspective, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on those and this issue of what's on paper versus what seems to be working, at least so far, based on the data we've got.
Thank you, Greg. I think from the South African perspective, we have seen the introduction of carbon locking through carbon tax, which was what I was saying, that it was introduced in 2019, which I think it's the reason why then you'd find that some of the industry companies or the big industry that are contributing to our GDP, they are currently investing now in the renewable energy. It's because of the carbon tax that was actually introduced in South Africa. And secondly, we have seen also programs on the use of or better use of energy or energy usage, which whereby then the government is actually, when it comes to more especially the households, the government has actually introduced subsidies to households that are actually having solar panels, rooftop solar panels. Then if you invest in such, there will be a subsidy that government will actually assist that particular household with. But then when it comes to programs on energy efficiency, I think that's where we actually need improvements on, more especially when it comes to the buildings, as well as some of the appliances that the households have. We also have seen the repurposing or decommissioning of old coal-fired power stations, which is, we have decommissioned one power station, and currently there's a big noise around such because there's been a reduced employment rate in that particular area and people have lost their jobs. So in South Africa, we have not really explored we have not really explored programs that that the government has not really explored some of the programs that leads to also having assistance when it comes to or subsidizing such programs. So we have also R&D work that is ongoing when it comes to carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is funded by the World Bank, but it's still at an R&D level. It's not, that work is really not at a commercial level. So we are really, I think we are still way behind, or South Africa is actually very slow. I think also it's due to the fact that the country, it's still a developing country. So the uptake of new technologies then becomes an issue. But then I think we are very slow when it comes to having programs that are actually subsidized by the government. I think that's it from my side. Thank you, Greg.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of the insights, and hopefully the audience has enjoyed getting some of the different perspectives from our different panelists in the different regions. I guess I'd like to maybe just go around the panelists and if you reflect a little bit on our discussion around policy and regulatory environments and compare and contrast, just any kind of closing thoughts that you have on what we've heard and also maybe things, focus areas maybe going forward. So maybe Madeline, start with you.
I got to go last, right along, and so I guess it's my turn to have to think quickly on my feet. Thanks, Greg. I mean, I guess what I would say is that, you know, it's easy in this line of work to get pretty bogged down in the details, and you know, get frustrated by the pace of change. You know, I think that we've come far enough now where, you know, we can see what a net zero world might look like, whether that's 2050 or 55 or 60 or whatever it may be. You know, a net zero world is one where people have healthier communities than they do today. There's a more secure and reliable and affordable energy supply than there is today. People have more sustainable local jobs than they do today. And, you know, there's no discounting the importance that energy plays in the global economy. It is the central pillar of the global economy. And so if we can effectively transition, you know, that's a much better world than we have today. And it's not that far away, right? And yes, there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work between here and there to get us to that point. And clearly paying close attention to unintended consequences, you know, trying to anticipate the problems, trying to de-risk the future before we are sort of looking in the rearview mirror, wishing we had done things differently. Those are our responsibilities as this generation of practitioners and academics and government officials. So you know, I feel very hopeful that we can get through this and do it right. But I'd encourage folks on the phone, if they're early career professionals, people who are considering spending their time and their expertise and their attention and their commitment on this issue, I would really encourage you to do so. It's one of the great challenges that we will face as a globe and as a society, and it's really interesting too. A lot of fun, good people, and that's what I would say to wrap up.
Okay, great. As we close, Dr. Nandi, your brief thoughts.
I think as we are closing, I think from my side, really, it's a matter of we all need to be, I think there has to be partnership amongst the society, industry, as well as government, because government's responsibility is to actually draft policies and promulgate such, but then also the industry is needed in that process, as well as the society is needed. I think from the society's side, if then more public awareness can actually be made and to actually bring comfort to the society that right now we're on this phase that we're in of just energy transition, and our strategy is actually, you know, if the strategy has been defined, to say that the strategy, it needs to be explained to the public servants so that they can actually be comfortable with the decisions or with the policies that are actually there. And I think then the issue of just energy transition and how to actually transition will actually be implemented and be executed if there is comfort amongst those three stakeholders, actually the two stakeholders, which is the industry and the society, because I think those are the implementers of such. I think from my side, yes, the government is, when it comes to policy and regulation, there's been much that has been made, or much progress that has been made on that aspect. But then I think the issue currently, it's the society itself. It's people believing that we're going to lose jobs. Where are we then going to? What are the plans? So that's why then I'm mentioning actually the importance of public awareness, because we need to also bring people on board into the plans that the government has. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Leonie, your closing thoughts?
Yes, very quickly. They were already great closing thoughts by the previous speakers. I'm not gonna repeat them. Just one more, because we are already 1 minute behind. One more additional thought. Returning to the just transition definitional issue, let's put it like that. I think there is a risk that just transition as a term becomes a buzzword rather than a legal concept or a right, and I saw it happening with sustainable development already, which started as a principle, as an objective, but in the end it had been captured to serve all kinds of purposes and all kinds of directions and all kinds of argumentation, and I see that there's the same risk happening to the concept of just transition. So I guess we as academics need to do our best to give it a good academic, theoretical underpinning, and the practitioners in the room need to do their best to frame it, to understand it, to use it in the context and interpretation that it originally has. So I think that is a closing
great.
from me.
Well, thank you very much. Particular thanks to all four of our panelists. I think you provided some very interesting perspectives, and which are, by definition, quite different. I think that's very insightful for our audience. So I want to thank you very much for that. And I'll turn it back over to Julianne for a wrap up.
Thanks, Greg. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you, Leonie, Nandi, Madeline as well. Those of you who are here, we invite you to come back for our final session in this series. It will be Tuesday, November 14th at the same time, and we will be addressing the financing of the energy transition, again, from many different perspectives from different regions of the world. I'd also invite you to review prior session recordings if you missed them. We've looked at a general overview of the issue, repurposing legacy assets, the role of technology, and also skills and development in business education as it relates to the energy transition in different contexts. I put a link to where you can find those recordings in the chat, and welcome you to explore those, and hope to see you on the 14th of November. Thanks again.